It's fairly clear that Jesus died a Jew and never had any intention of starting a new religion. His goal was to reform Judaism and to bring new sets of laws and new expectations to the temple and to the Jewish people. So after the death of Jesus, obviously there was a lot of disagreement between the apostles about how Jesus' legacy was going to be preserved and continued. And the most important of the apostles, not the immediate 12 apostles, so they're going to have they follow in the Jewish tradition, and they're continuing to work within that Jewish tradition to try and bring reform to their own people. But the Apostle Paul is a very different situation. He begins a Jew, but is going to convert to Christianity in a very different sort of Christianity. So Christianity as we know it, Jesus really wasn't, when he died, a Christian in the way that we would think of it, which is weird, but he was not in favor of a new religion. Paul was. Paul thought that Jesus' message meant something different, meant something new. And what's interesting about this is if you look at the timing of the life of Paul, you'll see that he was born about 9 years after Jesus was. So a little bit younger, but lived during the same period of time. So if you look at his time while he was studying to be a rabbi, you'll notice that that time was pretty much the same time that Jesus was also preaching. So he would have known Jesus personally. And he was known initially as somebody who was an extraordinary persecutor of Jews. Paul was a very highly intelligent, extremely argumentative Jew. And he argued that Jesus was a fraud, that he didn't follow the law, that his crucifixion was evidence of this, and that his resurrection was simply not believable. It was a symbolic thing, and that the disciples had robbed the grave and made the whole story up. So he believed that the Christians, those who were beginning to follow Jesus in a different way, were loosening the Jewish laws and just simply were to be dismissed out of hand. They were ridiculous and they were dangerous to Judaism in general. So again, Saul, as he was originally known as his Jewish name, was a persecutor of Jews. And if you look at how the Bible is put together, you notice that Jesus dies just around 30 CE, slightly before then. But if you look at the books there, and it's important to remember that Paul is going to write 14 of the 27 books of the New Testament. Now that's extremely significant. He writes the majority of the books of the New Testament. And if you look at the timing of it, so right around 50 CE, Thessalonians, Galatians, Philemon, Philippians, Corinthians, and Romans, these are all extremely important books that define who Jesus is. And notice that they are written chronologically before the Gospels. The Gospels appear above the blue timeline: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And so the timing of this is important. He's going to be writing both before the Gospels and after them. And so literally he is shaping the way the Gospels are being written and the way they are to be interpreted. So he literally has the final say in the New Testament. And so in terms of the development of Christianity, the importance of Paul simply can't be overstated. So as I said a few minutes ago, Paul was a very respected and feared up-and-coming rabbi. And if you want to know where he was from, Tarsus is an important place in southern Turkey. This was in the area where there was enormous cultural diversity. Paul spoke Hebrew, he spoke Greek, he spoke Latin. So he had tremendous command of language. He also was at the intersection of classical culture. So he would have known about the Greek mystery cults who believed in resurrection and in eating the blood and body of their Savior or their God as a form of communicating with that God. So the way that we understand communion, or at least Christians understand communion, comes from those traditions. So he's incorporating the things that he learns in Tarsus as a Jew there, understanding that Judaism was one form of religion amongst many, many other forms. So Tarsus, unlike Jerusalem, Jerusalem was really very much the focus for the Jews at that point. But Tarsus was both more multicultural and a lot more multi-religious too. So as Paul enters the picture, you'll notice that he spends his time, like a good Jew, studying at the temple in Jerusalem. And as Jesus comes into the picture and then dies, he, at this point, his name is Saul. Saul is going to be the lead persecutor of Christians. He's going to argue against them. He's going to publicly debate with them in the temple. And the most famous of these debates is the debate that he has with Stephen. Now, Stephen was also a well-known Christian who was arguing that basically Jesus had brought a new law, and that therefore Jesus was not really following in the Jewish tradition, but represented a new tradition. Now, Paul was brought in to debate Stephen, and this was a long debate. And again, Stephen was a respected and loved person. Came with a lot of kindness and gentleness. And Paul was sort of the type of, if you think of him as sort of an intense, lawyerly type, he just wanted to rip you apart intellectually. So Paul and Stephen debate, and Stephen wins the debate. But Paul follows up, because he was upset about losing, by viciously attacking him, sarcastically, and talking about how ridiculous he is, and tries to get Stephen to say blasphemous things, and finally gets the Jewish authorities to put him on trial. Stephen criticizes the judges just the way Jesus did, criticizing the Sanhedrin and criticizing the Jewish authorities, and arguing that they had, in essence, helped to kill Jesus. And because he makes this statement, Stephen is convicted of blasphemy. And the punishment for blasphemy is being stoned to death. So Paul is there as Stephen is stoned to death. It's a brutal killing. And so again, Paul is responsible for this. He brings the trial. He literally throws the first stone. And so this is in 34 CE. You'll notice that shortly after this, literally the day after the stoning, he is on his way back home to Damascus. He's heading to Damascus on his way back to Tarsus. And if you don't know where Damascus is north of Jerusalem. It's not on this map. But he has what is pretty much the most famous conversion experience in religious history. According to this, the story that Paul gives, there's no thunderstorm or violent wind. There's nothing. He just falls off his horse, and there's a bright light, a piercing light, and he hears the voice of Jesus saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he asks, this is Saul, "Who are you, Lord?" And Jesus responds, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Now this, of course, throws Saul into a deep state of confusion, because he doesn't believe in Jesus, and certainly he doesn't believe in a resurrected Jesus. And there are a lot of debates about what this could mean. Some people believe that Saul may have had temporal epilepsy, that this could have been a hallucination. Some people believe that, again, psychologically, the horror of the stoning and his responsibility in it caused him to kind of flip psychologically in this moment from being a persecutor of Christians to a defender of Christians. But whatever the case, or simply, if you want the religious argument, that he had a true faith-based religious conversion. And certainly this is the way that Christians view it, that this conversion was critical. And so this is the beginning of a long ministry that Paul is going to engage in, which is going to bring him to all corners of the Roman world. And if you look at this, you'll see that before he goes on these journeys, he actually goes to Saudi Arabia and he spends a couple of years in the desert. And if you remember, this is exactly what Jesus does before his ministry. So in some ways, Saul, who's now Paul because of his conversion, just as Abram becomes Abraham, right? He converts, he goes to the desert, and then he engages in a long period of ministry where he is going around the Roman Empire, particularly the eastern part, in northern Greece, down through Turkey, in through Syria, into even Jerusalem, and speaking to Hellenized Jews. These were not the original, not the Jews of Jerusalem so much, that really wanted nothing to do with him, who felt that he was an apostate, that he rejected them, and that he was sort of a dangerous kind of Christian who was going around trying to convert people and also to set up churches, which he was setting up in synagogues in all of these different places. So the books of the New Testament that are named after places, Corinthians, Romans, Thessalonians, these books are named after places where these churches were, and Paul was out there setting up communities of Christians all over the empire. And so obviously there's going to be a tremendous emphasis on conversion here. And Paul is going to emphasize the importance of faith. So this is from Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not as a result of your works or your actions, so that no one may boast. Now, what's most important is that Paul is going to abandon the Jewish laws, and he is going to embrace a new way of thinking about the law. The law is not, all of these 613 commandments that the Jews had to follow. It's simply the law based in the faith of Jesus. So he simplifies the religion. He makes it accessible. He allows non-Jews to enter into the religion. If you're looking at the passages that I gave to you, you'll notice that most of what he's doing here is changing the nature of circumcision and looking at the laws as metaphorical things, not literal ones. So he claims that Abraham wasn't chosen by God because he was the first Jew. He wasn't chosen so that he would go to Judea and start a new religion. He was chosen by God because he had faith in God. It was his deep faith in God that caused him to leave Samaria, and that faith in God is really what makes you Christian. And you don't need to follow all of these other laws. So this allows for a lot more different people to come into the religion. Now, as the religion grows, obviously the Christians become a threat not only to the Jewish authorities as the Jews are beginning to move into the various parts of the empire, right, as they begin to after the destruction of the temple, they're going to be pushed into Turkey, into Greece, into all of these different areas, and they're going to assimilate to these cultures. And of course, the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem are trying to pull them back, right, to try to get them to not abandon their Judaism. Whereas in the middle of all this, Paul is trying to create a new church. And his whole idea is that Jesus is a resurrected God, and that you can communicate with Jesus through your faith, and that the communion, the eating of the blood and body of Christ allows you to directly establish that relationship. So all that you need to do is to convert that and to have that relationship with Jesus, who can save you personally from your sin, from your wrongdoings. And this idea, which is very much the belief that most Christians these days have about the nature of Jesus, is established by Paul. So the Christians are going to be severely martyred throughout the empire, in the Colosseum, eaten by lions, stoned by the Jews. And Paul just gets absolutely pummeled through his whole life. He gets beaten several times, stoned once, attacked by the Romans, and of course ultimately beheaded. And he's going to die in Rome, being accused of helping to undermine Nero. And so finally Paul dies, but he leads to the beginning of this new religion, and that's his significance in the story.